I really want to thank the organizing committee for having me here today. I'm very honored to be here and to have this opportunity to share our work with you. As George mentioned, we previously presented this data on Saturday, so I've tried to summarize everything, so there will definitely be some overlap. But at the end, we really want to focus on some more practical implementations of this work. So in the industry today, we know that sow performance has improved over the last few years, with the industry seeing an improvement about 2 to 3 pigs per sow per year. Most of this improvement has been seen in litter size and farrowing rates, and it can be attributed to genetic improvements, improved production practices, and the implementation of good gilt management programs. However, in recent years, a lot of the focus has been trying to be switched to improving sow lifetime performance. So as part of the National Pork Board study, they created an initiative 8 years ago now to improve sow lifetime productivity. And they defined it as being the total number of quality pigs weaned due to the productive life of a female, from the time that she becomes breeding eligible until the time that she leaves the herd. And there are 2 key aspects to this definition. The first one being longevity, how long she remains in the herd, and the second being productivity. However, in the study that we looked at, we're looking at the productivity or the efficiency of the sows at the multiplication level. So we've redefined this definition just slightly, and we're looking at the total number of quality replacement gilts produced during the productivity or the lifetime of that replacement female or that multiplication female. So we know that there are several limiting factors for sow lifetime productivity. The first one is retention rate. And from the literature, we know that it's the greatest source of variation in retention rate is the early removal of young sows from the herd. Some sows are very unproductive. Data shows 10% actually never farrow a litter. 15 to 20% of sows only produce 1 litter. And 40 to 50% of sows are called prior to third parity. So this is an area that we have a lot of opportunity for improvement. The second limiting factor for sow lifetime productivity is reproductive failure. Some of the data shows that 40 to 65% of calls can be attributed to reproductive failure, and a good proportion of these reproductive failures are gilts. Another limiting factor is non-productive days. Again, data shows 70% of non-productive days are due to reservice and culling intervals. What we'd really like to show, and the basis of our work, is we know that there are some new limiting factors for sow lifetime productivity. The group in Brazilian, led by Dr. Bertolosa, have done a lot of work in looking at the effect of low individual birth weight on future performance. They have shown that low birth weights for gilts carry risk for poor early survival and postnatal growth, and they carry risk for limited reproductive tract development. The focus on our work is to look at a repeatable low birth rate phenotype at the nucleus and multiplication level. We know that sows that have carry the low birth rate phenotype carry all the same risk as we just discussed above, but as a litter trait. They limit the efficiency of genetic transfer program in the herd, and they carry a transgenerational environmental risk. So they pass these traits down to the replacement females. And another thing that has become a big problem for the industry is that the high birth weight gilts or the increased growth rates are becoming an increasing problem for sow lifetime productivity. So this slide shows what we feel are the stages of a good gilt replacement program. And what we really want to emphasize is a gilt becomes a potential replacement female at birth. So good gilt management starts early. We feel this is showing the overall steps to a good gilt management program. As I mentioned, it starts at birth. We call this pre-selection. So gilts should need good conformation, have adequate number of teats, good health, good structure. What we're going to show is litter of origin has an important factor. The next phase is final selection. And this is really the ability of the gilt to reach puberty in response to direct contact with boars and boar stimulation, or puberty stimulation. Ultimately, we'd like to see 125% of requirements enter this stage, And overall, we'd like 80% of gilts in, reaching puberty within 28 days, and an additional 5 to 10% of non-select gilts. Finally, the final stage is breed group management, and this is essential. We'd like to see 100% of breeding targets met, 100% using select gilts, that have reached the proper breeding targets, second to third estrus, and feed management before breeding is essential. A lot of the time, you can be doing everything right here, but if you don't manage these factors, you're still not going to see the results that you're looking for. So factors such as genetics, health programs, nutrition, your airflow and temperature, stocking density, people are so important in biosecurity, are all factors that you need to consider. So for the remainder of the talk, what I'm going to talk about is how an efficient gilt replacement program is really has two key components. The first one, being litter of origin, is a key factor in determining the efficiency of a replacement gilt program and future cell lifetime productivity. And the second one is that an effective gilt stimulation program can resolve many of your cell lifetime productivity issues. And there are three components to this that we'll talk about. So what we really want to identify is that common reproductive problems that arise in your sow herd can result from failure to address the key components of good gilt management. So these are the components I just talked about: litter of origin, failure to maintain a consistent supply service eligible gilt, failure to select the most fertile gilts, and the inappropriate management for body state at breeding. So in your herd, if you're noticing that you have high mortality, low retention of gilts through the selection program, low efficiency and poor growth, this can be attributed back to birth weight phenotype. If you notice you have delayed onset of estresses, poor responses to boar exposure, you're not meeting circus targets, your gilts are too old or too heavy, and you have high non-productivities, this can be due to the gilt stimulation program that you've implemented. And likewise, poor retention, poor lifetime productivity, high replacement rates or low litter sizes, or if sows are returned late after first weaning. Again, this can be linked back to failure to select the most fertile animals. And finally, there's a lot of overlap here, but even factors like poor performance in first lactation can be linked back to the not having gilts in the proper weight at breeding. So we're going to start talking about litter of origin as a key factor. So here we're talking about within litter variation. On the horizontal axis, we have 6 different sows, and each point within the sow represents an individual pig weight born to that sow. So you can see on paper, these sows are exactly the same. They have an average total born of 14 and an average litter birth weight of 1.4 kilograms. However, you can see that the composition of their litters are very different, both in the variation around the mean and the number of gilts that fall below 1 kilogram, which is the risk weight for detrimental effects on future performance. This is in comparison to the birth weight phenotype. Again, so we have 6 different sows. Each point represents an individual pig. But you can see that there are 2 distinct groupings of sows or different phenotypes these sows have. We have sows that have the high birth weight phenotype. So although they have 14 total born, average litter size is about weight is about 1.9 kilograms, compared to these sows that have the low birth weight phenotype, where every single pig within that litter is going to be at risk. The other important thing about the birth weight phenotype is its repeatable trait. So as shown here, again, we have 4 different sows, but here it shows that this sow, over her repeatable life, so parity 2 to 6, every single litter that she had was the low birth weight phenotype. So this represents another problem, but also another opportunity for improvement. So the title of our National Pork Board project was the effective litter of origin and cell lifetime productivity. We worked with Holden Farms, and very thankful to their team for the amount of work that they did for us. They determined the litter birth weight phenotype on about 700 sows over at least 3 litters. In total, they weighed about 47,000 piglets for us. And once we determined phenotype, about 7,500 gilts were individually tagged, and we followed them through their productive life. We took measurements All measurements for culling and mortality was recorded for every gilt, and we had all production records until third parity or until the time she left the herd. So this graph shows how we classified birth weight phenotype. On the horizontal axis, we have individual sow, and it sorted or it showed her litter average birth weight over at least 3 parities. So as you can see, some of the sows, their average litter birth weight phenotype was about 1 kilogram compared to some about nearing 2 kilograms. The green line shows the relationship to total born. As you can see, it is confounded by total born. There's a slight relationship as you increase in average litter birth weight. It is negatively related to total born. So how we analyze this, or what we looked at, we classified the sows into 4 different categories. Those having the low birth weight phenotype, low, medium, medium high, and high. The two extremes represented about 10% of the population, and this is because we really wanted to target those extreme sows. So on Saturday we spent a lot of time actually going through the data, but today we're just going to summarize the results that we saw. So we know that the sows that have the repeatable low birth weight phenotype, as an example here, we know that they produce many of the small pigs born within your herd. About 30% of your low birth weight pigs born are born to these 10% of the sows with a repeatable phenotype. We know that sows that have the low birth weight phenotype have low gilt retention. By the time gilts are selected at 170 days of age, only 40% of them still remain in the herd compared to about 55 to 60% of the other sows. Likewise, they produce very few select gilts. Those sows that produce gilts that have the low birth weight phenotype have a negative effect on growth potential of the progeny. As I mentioned before, this is a transgenerational effect. So the sows at the nucleus level pass these traits on to the sows at the commercial level. So they really have a negative impact on your terminal line growth. What we also know, however, if we actually get these gilts into production, their overall performance isn't that bad. So, and this is really important to point out, this is using effective gilt stimulation programs. So we're going to talk about this later in the presentation, but selecting the best gilts, birth weight phenotype had little effect on puberty attainment or retention rate or litter size to parity 4. So the next thing we want to discuss is that we know they have a lot of negative impacts. What can we do to improve the efficiency of these sows? The first thing is to determine sow birth weight phenotype early in your multiplication sows. So this does involve weighing the litters of individual pigs. We do recommend culling sows with a repeatable low birth weight phenotype at the nucleus multiplication level. We feel this will increase the efficiency of the genetic transfer program and increase the number of select gilts that are ultimately bred. It might be good to impose a minimum birth weight on all replacement females, and we can use strategies to improve weaning weights. And I'll just briefly talk about this. This was Dr. Billy Flowers and his graduate student Charlotte Melly were a part of our national pork birth study. And they looked at strategic cross-fostering techniques at the multiplication level. So we identified a group of sows with the low birth weight phenotype, so less than 1.3 kilograms in this case. And he looked at 2 different treatment groups. He looked at those that had an increased litter size. So throughout lactation, they were nursing 15.8 pigs and ultimately had the weaning weight of 13.2 pounds. And the other group was called the reduced litter size. So he reduced the size of the lactating litter, as shown here. So then they're nursing 12.9 pigs, and ultimately they weaned heavier pigs. So as we can see, if you look 100% of gilts born, by the time these gilts were delivered to the farm, those gilts that were lactating with reduced litter size, had higher retention rate, so about 60 to 50%. And by the time the gilts were rebred at third parity, there is a definite advantage to the productivity of those gilts lactated in lower litters. The other problem, as I alluded to before, is that we're starting to see that the the high birth weight gilts are a problem as well at the multiplication level. Our data shows that those gilts born to high birth weight phenotype sows have higher postnatal growth potential. They have higher retention rates to the start of puberty stimulation. But some of the problem is they're starting to exceed the upper limits for birth weight or weight at service. But what we are starting to see is that those gilts, once they get in the herd, have lower retention rates and have a decreased or compromised cell lifetime productivity. Some strategies that we can look at to help the high birth weight phenotype sows. And Dr. Lentz is going to talk about different feeding strategies, as shown here. And again, we want to make sure we have good gilt stimulation programs present. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So as we mentioned, there are really three key risk factors in good gilt development unit management. The first one is failure to select the most fertile females, failure to maintain a consistent supply of service-eligible gilts, and the inappropriate management of body weight at breeding. So this data is from Dr. Valet as part of the early part of the National Pork Board study. What he did, he started about 1,200 gilts, entered the Gilt Development unit to start exposure to boars. He started this about 160 days of age and continued on to either they reached puberty or about 100 days afterwards. In this situation, this environment was actually probably the optimal environment. They're free of disease, they had good health, good stocking density, so they're really able to exhibit their true potential. So as you can see, the distribution from age of puberty in these 1,200 females is shown here. It's skewed to the right. Dr. Valet has identified, in total, 95% of these gilts did reach puberty. Dr. Valet suggested that there are three minor distributions shown here, early, mid, and late. Sorry. And what he suggested is that the late returning or the late group are going to be those sows with the reduced cell lifetime productivity. And this really corresponds well to what we believe. We believe that those gilts naturally cycle within 30 days after boar exposure are called select gilts, as shown here. And those gilts that take longer to come to heat, you may call them those hardheads that you keep checking and checking until they come into heat, are called non-select gilts. And we do recommend that these are called opportunity females and only enter the herd if needed to meet your breeding targets. There's a lot of work or a lot of literature showing that select gilts are more productive than non-select females. Select gilts are inseminated earlier and have fewer non-productive days. Those gilts reaching puberty earlier, so the youngest third compared to the oldest third, there's an increased percent of return to estrus within 10 days after first weaning. Select gilts are culled less due to reproductive problems. They have higher farron rates, more pigs born alive, and a longer reproductive life. And Dr. Knox, who is a big part of our study too, showed that boar exposure and time to pubertal response have lasting effects on cell lifetime productivity. So there's really a lot of evidence to show that good heat checking and the ability to identify your gilts in heat earlier has really lasting effects on cell lifetime productivity. We're not going to spend much time on this because we just want to summarize what we think are the key components to a good stimulation program. The first one is having a very precise and puberty stimulation program that involves 28 days of direct and fence line contact to the boars. We always use a boar exposure area. Direct contact with high libido boars is important. Your boars have to be chomping and foaming like this guy is. Dedicated and trained staff is essential. And also, record keeping is essential. It goes back to the old saying, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So this graph shows just a quick overview of what we achieve when we have good gilt management programs. So here on the horizontal axis, we have days to puberty after first boar exposure, and then the cumulative percent of gilts reaching puberty. Each one of these lines represents about a group of 300 females. So as you can see, by about 28 days, we have nearly 80% of gilts with a recorded heat, either a natural heat or one with a PG600 induced heat. What is really important is that only select gilts, or those gilts with a known heat, known serve, are delivered to the sow farm. The last key component is the appropriate management at service. All gilts should be bred at second and third estrus. They have a weight between 135 and 150 kilograms. Associated growth rates is about 600 grams a day to less than about 800. And they have to have good stall acclimation for feed intake 14 days prior to service. So in the remainder few minutes of my talk, I'm just going to maybe just ask some questions and to see, are your gilt development protocols limiting the efficiency of gilt replacement in your herd? So I'm going to look at it as the various stages of production. So the first question you really need to consider is when do you I have the air up there? When do you start managing your replacement gilts? Is it in the finisher barn? You go into the finisher barn and pull your gilts out? Or do you start where you think you really need to at birth? We believe that you need to determine sow phenotype early, as I mentioned. Post-farrion or day one care is essential to reduce chilling and hypothermia, ensure adequate colostrum ingestion. Like I say, you can implement strategies such as cross-fostering on all your replacement females, and consider doing some minimum birth weights on all replacement females. The next factor, things you have to talk about is what are your facilities like for your gilt stimulation protocols? What do you have for boar power? Do you have enough boar power? Are your boars lazy and old, or they have good libido and they actually do the job that they're supposed to? Do you have trained and motivated staff? I think Aaron Hansen from Holden Farms really said that how important it is to changing the culture on your farm to recognize gilts are really the priority for your daily duties. The next question, related to what are your gilt development protocols, not only but are they measurable, but how do they affect your future, your responses? This graph shows your age at first estrus as shown here, but there's 3 different puberty stimulation programs. Those ones starting about 170 days of age in the bear system, showed here. Sorry. Some cases when in situations like you, for example, you have a PRRS break protocol, you obviously have to change what happens. And in this situation, it's an ISO gilt development unit entry into the sow farm. So gilts, there's no bear system, but boars are brought to the gilt pens for puberty stimulation. What you can see, there's obvious effects on your age of puberty, and likewise going to be on weight at puberty. The other thing we need to consider is the cost of these non-productive days. There's about 45 non-productive days. What does that cost to your farm? Also, if you keep heat checking for longer and longer periods, what is the cost of adding non-select gilts to your farms? The next question I think you need to consider too are what are your gilt selection targets? We know that 95% of gilts will reach puberty if you check them long enough. So if your target's at 95%, you will achieve that eventually. But what is the cost of that? We know as you keep adding more and more percent of your gilts to the herd, 90, 95, 100%, you enter more and more non-select gilts. So you're going to have a negative effect on having higher selection rates. The next thing, this might look exactly like the data I just showed you, but this is actually work from a pipestone project we did in 2004, and you see the exact same responses. Sorry. So is variation the new norm that we're dealing with? You can see some responses are really good and some aren't. Sorry. So these effects might be due to season or health or management or feed or mycotoxins. And it shows really the negative effect they can have on your response rates. And how do we deal with this? So this slide just shows, again, we know that weight is important, but do you actually measure your gilts? Do you weigh them? Do you have some sort of weight? Here we can show again that even your gilt development protocols have such a drastic effect on the weight that they're served. That this is our target weight zone. We can see, depending on your protocols, most of your gilts may be already overweight at service. The next thing, we more and more believe that records are essential. Again, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. Sorry. So you need records. You need to record the data and analyze the results. Good gilt management program records, as shown here. You want to look at these curves. Again, this is a different farm. It looks exactly the same. I can tell you here that this is actually a seasonal effect. So you can, once you know this, you can take action to maybe make some changes to your protocols. Ensure that you have good weights that heat no serves, as shown here. And the other thing is, a lot of your cell management programs do have the capabilities to analyze some of this data, but are you actually using them? So look at your arrival to first service interval to make sure your gilts are having the 14-day stall acclimation. Know what estrus they're bred on. Look at your weights at first service. So really, with all this information, you can tailor results to your farm and really benchmark to improve performance. So in conclusion, like I said, there are two key components. I think starting gilt management early is looking at litter of origin, and really having rigorous pre-breeding management protocols are essential to improve cell lifetime productivity.